Good morning, everybody. Trust everyone had as good a night's sleep as I did. It's amazing what an inch and a half of foam from Walmart will do. That was the best $25 I've spent in a long time. Thanks again for a great day yesterday, and looking forward to a great day today. Thanks for some of the comments. You know, we definitely, I can tell, have some nerds in the audience here that, you know, came up, and to be quite honest, half the comments were complaints about something that had gone wrong with their Ford in the past, but that's fine. That's fine. You know, we always welcome feedback and, you know, try to do better in the future. But no, we seriously, thanks very much for the interest in this topic. We did have a Sister Nikki sighting yesterday, so that was good. We were able to kind of pry her out of her work setup there, and enjoyed some nice walk in the afternoon and evening program, and some very spiritually minded and highly compassionate games of euchre. Right, Dave? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Brother Guy, he got a little mad at me for not offering him the cut. So, you know, I'm officially apologizing, and, you know, we'll see if we can do better tonight. Okay, so on to our topic for today, which is prototyping mistakes. So, a couple comments before we dig into this. Number one, I totally forgot to mention to the reading brother to remind everyone to look for things in this chapter that we're pulling them away from Christ. So maybe as we get started here, just scan through Colossians 2 and see if you can find anything that looked like they were getting pulled away from Christ. Secondly, we are just going to preface this class by saying that this is perhaps the greatest collection of wrong things to do in the New Testament. So this class can be a little bit of a downer sometimes. We're going to try to make it interesting by looking at a lot of analogies to prototyping and engineering. But this is really the chapter where the Apostle Paul said what they're doing wrong, by and large. There's a couple oases in there scattered throughout. But sometimes that's what we need to do, right? We need to learn from the mistakes of others. We need to learn from some of the things they were doing that were pulling them away. And then we'll see in the later classes the more the positive of what they should be doing in prototyping Christ. Now, just to recap yesterday's class, Colossae, a sister ecclesia with Laodicea and Hierapolis, there in the Lycus Valley. Established during the third missionary journey by Epaphras. The Apostle Paul had not visited there, therefore there's no historical context in the Acts. Off to a good start. They were noted for their faith and love, but Paul and Epaphras prayed frequently and seemed really worried for them, to the point where he's using these Greek words from where we get agonize and agony. They literally were agonizing over the state of these ecclesias. Big theme from Colossians 1, Christ needs to be number one in our lives. And you remember all those, you know, he just repeats that point over and over and over again that, you know, Christ has the preeminence. He is the fullness. He is the firstborn. He is, everything needs to revolve around Christ. So we can kind of deduct that they were struggling with that. They were struggling with this idea that Christ was the one and only in their lives. Now, of course, in this day and age, you know, it's a struggle for all of us, and we certainly see the world struggling with this concept that there's only one number one in their lives. Then we introduce the idea of images, which is from the Greek word icon, the idea being an image, some sort of imperfect. You know, we want to be clear here. You know, we're not called to be perfect images of Christ, but in some way we have to reflect or be in some way a replication of some aspect of what Christ was, and how this translates to the idea of prototypes in engineering. You know, those are our icons in engineering, where we make a part that's like an early representation or some form of early version of the final product. And that's indeed this idea of images and icons. So the rest of the week we'll talk how we can most or least effectively prototype Christ in our lives. And today we're really going to be picking on intake manifolds. So does anyone remember what the intake manifold does?
Yes.
Brother Dave?
It mixes air, fuel.
Man? Evenly distributes it to all the cylinders of the engine. All right, you guys, man, you're hired. You looking for work, my friend? Hired, fired. Well, we'd probably fire you right after we hired. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so we're going to be taking some examples of, let's say, how we didn't do a very good job of prototyping throughout the years, and then kind of compare that to a spiritual level of what the Apostle Paul cited as reasons they were getting pulled away from Christ and reflecting Christ in their lives. Okay, but before we do that, we just get these continued warnings that something was wrong. In Colossians 2 verse 4, "And this I say, lest any man should beguile you with enticing words." The word here is literally to deceive, right? So the things that were pulling them away from Christ were not necessarily totally obvious. They're maybe a bit more subtle in nature, and we'll see that as we go through the list. Hopefully you're all scanning through Colossians 2 right now and seeing if you can find any of these things. "Beware lest any man spoil you." And the idea here of spoil is like, you know, when someone got invaded and the invader carried them away as spoil. You know, that's what can happen if we get pulled away from Christ by these things the Apostle Paul is going to mention. And my favorite one, "Let no man beguile you." And similar to Brother Allen, I have no idea how to pronounce this Greek word, but you can see it on the screen there. In the Greek, it literally means against umpire. So has anyone ever played baseball here? Do we have any baseball players? You ever felt like you got a bad call from the umpire? You know, it was a ball, but he called it a strike. Or if you're a pitcher, it was a strike and he or she called it a ball. Anyone ever had that experience here? So that's literally what this word means. It's almost like a corrupt umpire. Hey, that ump has it out for me, and I'm just getting bad calls. And that's really the idea behind this term is someone is just working against us to pull us away from Christ. So let's dig in here. Something or some things were pulling them away from Christ. So let's look through chapter 2, and let's just do a little group brainstorming here. I know it's got a big room here, but let's just see, based on just a scan through Colossians 2, did you see anything in there that looked like, all right, maybe that's something that's yanking them away from being images of Christ? Just feel free to shout it out. Sister Beth?
Deceptive philosophy.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Sister Beth.
Deceptive philosophy.
Deceptive philosophy. All right, you're on to one of the main ones. Excellent. Go ahead.
Fine-sounding arguments.
Yeah, fine-sounding arguments. So you're probably poking on the same thing there, but there was definitely some philosophy we see early on in the chapter that was pulling them away from Christ. Anything else anyone noticed?
Legalistic.
Yeah. Legalistic. Excellent. Fantastic. There was some legalism issues. Yes.
Principles of the world.
Principles of the world. Yep, and he actually uses this kind of strange phrase, rudiments of the earth, which is another, connected idea. Yes?
An angel.
Worshiping angels. Wow, you guys are good. You're getting to the end of the chapter. Go ahead.
Human tradition.
Human traditions. Awesome. Yep, go ahead.
False humility.
False humility. Excellent. All right, so you guys are really capturing a good broad section of the ideas that we're pulling them away from Christ. We're going to go through each one of those. You've pretty much got them all. And we're gonna first look a little bit at what exactly was it that was pulling them away from Christ. And then we're going to nerd out a little bit and talk about the analogy to prototypes in engineering. So we're going to break this into 4 different problems. Okay, so the first problem you guys have already picked up on, which is this philosophy that was floating around. So let's crack open our Bibles here to Colossians 2 in verses 2 through 3. That their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love, and into all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God and the Father and of Christ, and to whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So this is kind of the apostle talking about this philosophy from a positive standpoint, which is the good wisdom and the good knowledge of God and the mystery of God, which has been revealed in Christ. And then he gets into it in verse 8, where he says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men and after the rudiments of the world, or the elements of the world, and not after Christ. And really, the key word there is philosophy, which means the love of wisdom. And there's some other cross-references we could look at. In 1 Corinthians 1, the Greeks seek after wisdom, and in 1 Timothy 6, verse 20, oppositions of science from the Greek word gnosis, big clue there, falsely so called. Okay, so what is being spoken of here is a philosophy that was centered around knowledge and wisdom that was just starting to emerge in the first century. And really got rolling in the second century, to the point where the early church actually had to have conferences to kind of combat this idea. Does anyone know what I'm talking about here?
Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. Wow, smart audience here, because this is the toughest one. Yeah. Gnosticism was a big problem emerging in the first century. Now, Gnosticism, we're not going to go into detail on Gnostic theology, because we could do a whole class just on that. All right? It's completely bizarre. That's all I can tell you is, it separates the God of the Old Testament from the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is spoken of in kind of a negative light, and then Jesus was really the ambassador sent to pull everyone back to the, let's say, overall God that, let's say, had more of a focus on faith and love, as opposed to the God of the Old Testament. There's all these different beings that are involved. We're not going to get into that. But one thing we can say is there was a huge focus on knowledge. You had to just keep on reading their books, studying this idea of Gnosticism to the point where you almost reached a higher level of knowledge and your mind was open to this idea. The Gnostics considered material existence flawed or evil, and held that the principal element of salvation to be direct knowledge of the hidden divinity attained via mystical or esoteric insight. Many Gnostic texts deal not in the concepts of sin and repentance, but with illusion and enlightenment. The Gnostics of Paul's day had their own apocryphal books dedicated to the inner secrets of being and knowing. And there was actually many Gnostic books that they were even considering including those in the canon of Scripture at one point, and then no, those are all excluded because they really teach something different from the rest of the Bible. But you can see the big focus here is on knowledge, enlightenment, deep hidden understanding. Is that the Bible message? Is the Bible, do you need a PhD to understand what God's speaking about in the Bible? No. We know that the Bible message is and should be something that is simple and easy to understand. So this is a big thing that was going on in the New Testament times, really starting to pick up, that was pulling people away from Christ. You could almost call it like over-indexing on knowledge, where it was just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Now, I thought about, okay, is there a prototyping analogy here? Have we done something? Because remember, we're trying to be images or prototypes of Christ here. Is there some analogy we can find in the land of prototyping? And sure enough, there is. Because, prototypes are expensive, right? It costs money to make prototypes. So what is the CEO going to want? Fewer prototypes. Hey guys, figure out how to get this product out the door with less prototypes. So probably 10, 15 years ago, computers started getting powerful enough with the processing capabilities where we could try to do a lot of our testing analytically on the computer. You'd develop a program that would solve the physics equations and tell whether the part works or not analytically. How do you think that worked for us?
Good.
Sometimes it did. But the problem is it's very difficult on a computer to capture every last thing that happens in real life. A lot of times when let's say parts fail on a vehicle, it's some kind of unique combination of circumstances. Some weird atmospheric condition, environmental condition, maybe a extreme of cold and hot or high altitude, maybe seaside atmospheres, different fuels, oils. These things are really hard to capture in a computer model. So we decided, all right, we're going to make even more complicated computer models. And we're going to capture all these things. And we're going to buy more expensive computers and more processing capability. And we're going to solve all these equations mathematically and tell whether these parts work or not. You know what happened? The computer models got so complex that it was actually cheaper and quicker just to build the prototypes in the first place and run the tests. That's what happened. And the computer models never got good enough where they could capture every possible thing that could go wrong. So what were we doing? We were over-indexing on knowledge. We're like, oh, we're a bunch of smart engineers, we can solve these equations, and at the end of the day, it would have been better just to build the part and test it. Put it out into the field, so to speak. So this is an example of over-indexing on knowledge. We just kind of got trapped into this knowledge trap instead of building real things and putting them out into the real world. Now, I would say that, this is a general trend in society these days. I don't know how you guys feel, but it just seems like the whole world is over-indexing on knowledge. We have a transition to a knowledge-based economy. Does anyone kind of feel like you're in information overload? I know I do. It's just, we got so much information coming at us. You almost can't delete the emails fast enough, right? It's just the more you get out, the more comes in. And artificial intelligence, that is knowledge-based. I mean, artificial intelligence is basically compiling all the existing knowledge and, going through using some statistics to organize it and prioritize it and spit you out an answer. And, there's even some concern that this is going to start replacing people. Now, how do you think that's going to work? I don't think it's going to work that great. There really is no replacement for real life, right? And, there's also talk of autonomy, robotics, humanoid robotics, and with artificial intelligence. We've even been talking about, is there certain jobs on the assembly line where it would be better to have a semi-autonomous humanoid robot do that work? And then other areas where, we can get into information overload, social media, video games. But I'm wondering if the same problem can creep into the ecclesia, right? Where we just start to over-index on knowledge. Not that, I'm not saying that, we don't need to know the first principles of the truth, but just knowledge for the sake of knowledge that doesn't really lead anywhere in our lives. Can that become a problem in the truth? Because that's what Gnosticism was doing to them. Gnosticism was just becoming really just a big, mysterious quest for more knowledge to understand these very deep concepts, and it was pulling them away from Christ. So, worship of knowledge versus actions. And, we can see the subtlety in this, right? We have to read the Bible and understand the Bible, but it has to lead to a way of life, right? If it's just, hey, I found this point, boy, aren't I really smart? That's not what it's about. And that is a problem they struggled with, and a problem we can struggle with as well. So problem number 2 that was pulling them away from Christ, I think someone over here mentioned it, but this one's a little bit more obvious in the text. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of a new moon or of Sabbath days. These things are a shadow. Other cross references, ye that desire to be under the law, be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. So this was something that was definitely a big problem in the first century ecclesia. Anyone know what, this one's pretty obvious, but what was going on here? What were they kind of going back to? The law, right. They were going back to the law. Sometimes we refer to this as legalism. Now, can legalism be a problem in the ecclesia? Absolutely. Just like over-indexing on knowledge can be a problem, over-indexing on legalism can be a problem. And the interesting thing here is, if you read these verses in 1 Corinthians or in Colossians 2, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us and was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Sometimes we can skip those words against us and contrary to us. That those laws, those rules in the law of Moses were really intended to show them how sinful they were and how incapable they were of earning their own salvation. And I think sometimes in this day and age, it's easy to think rules are a bit harmless. They're, okay, brother so-and-so, they're just rules people, right? And, we need to just, it's okay. They can have a rules-based theology because that works for them. No, it doesn't. A rules-based theology doesn't work for any of us. Why is that? Why is a salvation through rules so dangerous? What does it cause us to stop doing?
Misinterpretation.
Right. We stop thinking, right? We stop interpreting the principles of the Scripture and applying them to specific situations. So a legalistic path to salvation is not harmless or benign. It will condemn us, a cross-reference there in Romans chapter 2. Now, engineering analogy, right? And once again, I don't want you guys to think too poorly about Ford Motor Company. We've learned our lessons, all right? So we're going back in history here. We're talking about, some things we stubbed our toes on in the past. Now, as you might expect, they all had to do with, hey, how can we save some money here, right? So, any ideas on how we decided to take a legalistic approach to prototypes? So, knowledge base, we said, okay, we're just going to build computer models in place of prototypes. All right? Because we're so smart, turns out we weren't that smart. How could we have taken a legalistic approach?
Outsourcing?
What's that?
Outsourcing?
Outsourcing? Yeah, we do a lot of that.
Corporate structure?
Oh man, we definitely got that. And they're the ones that came up with this idea. So let's go back to our intake manifold friend. When we're designing an intake manifold of Ford, is that the first time we've ever designed an intake manifold? No, we've designed tens, hundreds of these things, right? So we have had experiences in the past that has led to learnings. So those were all compiled into long lists, you'll love this, of design rules. We literally said, okay, here's your rules. Follow these rules and everything will be great, right? And we can save some money that way. So we came up with processes, there's putting a car into production is an incredibly complex endeavor. I'm surprised every time we launch a new car, I'm surprised that actually everything works and everything comes together. I mean, we have in the process from start to finish 60 milestones that you have to go through to get a car into production, right? There's lots of moving pieces, there's lots of requirements. But, we decided let's just put together a list of everything we've ever learned. We'll codify it as rules. Some of them we'll call guidelines, but some of them are standards. Thou shalt not, do this. Thou shalt do this. And that's how we'll roll. How did that work? Sounds like it should work, right? Sounds like it should work. Why wouldn't that work? No, who said that? All right, we got a winner. All right, if you have new requirements come up, let's say you're trying to increase horsepower, you're trying to increase torque, you got more demanding emissions requirements, lower fuel economy requirements. Do you think everything you learned in the past is going to be good enough for what lies in the future? No, right? So you have to do what? Think. You have to think and apply principles, really. In this case, physics principles, and think about what's new and what could go wrong with what's new. So just codifying everything in the past and just following those rules didn't work in engineering. But taking it back to a spiritual level, this rules-based approach is a problem we have in the ecclesia today. This idea of salvation through rules. And, I don't know if you've ever fallen into the trap of, hey, you know what? We need a rule. Let's make a rule. What usually ends up happening 3 weeks later? Oh, we didn't think of that. Right? And the rule comes back to bite you. But legalism, it's not benign. It's not an option if, that fits our personality better. Because it leads to, as soon as we have a system of rules set up, some people follow it better than others, right? It's just, some people are just going to, maybe the rules were more, just better set up for how they roll, but, it starts to create differences between brothers and sisters. Some are following the rules more than others. That can lead to, pridefulness, and it also can lead to judgmentalism, looking down on other brothers and sisters. And, also, over time, I've actually seen this, where if we've made a rule that's really hard to follow, we just kind of tend to get rid of it, right? And, hey, we're going to kind of de-emphasize that rule. But wherever I've kind of seen this creep into the truth, it certainly ultimately leads to a situation that's not very joyful. It kind of takes the fun out of the truth. The truth should be a fun thing for us. Some of the points that, I've been, Brother Allen's topic, Brother John's topic. I mean, just hearing what the Bible, those just gems that are lying just below the surface of the Bible, those are the principles. That's all we need. We don't need a ton of rules. We need the principles of the Bible to really operate in the truth effectively. So we have to ask the question, has legalism crept into the truth? Now, I'm not suggesting, and actually in our next class, we're going to talk about the right kind of knowledge. Not knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but knowledge that actually leads to something greater. We do need that. But the truth cannot become knowledge for the sake of knowledge, nor can it become a list of rules. Ultimately, the Bible is a principle book. It's not a rule book. So this is another thing that was pulling them away from Christ. Salvation through works. And I can just imagine that poor Colossian ecclesia, they were under a lot of pressure. And I think that's why the Apostle Paul uses, like even military terms, right? They were just standing in a defensive posture. And they had the legalists on this side, and they had the Gnostics on this side, and the Gnostics were like, oh, forget about the rules, you just need this like higher level of knowledge. And the legalists were like, well, forget about that, you just need this list of rules. And it was really putting a lot of pressure on that ecclesia. Unfortunately, there were even more things that were putting pressure on the ecclesia, which we'll cover here now. Okay, so problem number 3, somebody caught this one. Don't let anyone condemn you on the worship of angels, saying they have had visions about these things. And then, worship of angels. To be quite honest, before I started this study, I'd never really known that this was a thing. But it did help explain verses like Hebrews 1, where Paul goes on for an entire chapter stating that Jesus is superior to the angels. I'm like, yeah, we know that already, right? Why is he spending so much time talking about Jesus being better than the angels? Well, apparently, this worship of angels was a thing. And it was especially a thing in the Lycus Valley. They actually had to hold a council to defeat this idea or deal with this idea. But what would you call this if you would just kind of generalize this as something that was pulling them away from Christ? Anyone have any ideas? Superstition, excellent. Anything else? Idolatry, fantastic. I've come up with my own term, but it's along the lines of what you guys are going with here, which is hero worship, right? Think about the Jews. Who were their heroes, other than, like King David and so on? Who were their heroes in the Old Testament? Who led them through the wilderness? Angels, right? So this was a highly developed practice in later Judaism while entirely absent from apostolic teaching, and indeed clearly condemned here and in other places. And there was actually a council of Laodicea held later on near Colossae, which forbade Christians to leave the church and go away to name angels and secret assemblies, calling it a secret idolatry, thank you, and apparently connecting it with Jewish influences. So this was a whole thing going on that I didn't know about, right? But they were into worshiping angels. They had hierarchies of angels. They almost had like organization charts of angels. You know, they had a whole system set up of worshiping angels. Okay, let's talk about the prototyping analogy here. What in the world of automotive engineering could possibly equate to angel worship or hero worship?
Christians that have worked in the past.
I'm Paul, I'm Apollos. Yep. We're getting very warm.
I'm a Ford, I'm a chef.
I'm a Ford, I'm a chef. So so back in the good old days, there was only one way to get promoted at Ford, which was to go up into management, right? Then things started getting so complicated, they decided we need to make a parallel path of what they call technical experts. You know, people that didn't have people reporting to them but could get promoted just due to sheer technical knowledge and, you know, kind of almost like an internal consultant or somebody that was, you know, very knowledgeable on a certain topic. So we got into this practice of asking the expert. Hey, there's Bob over here. Bob has been doing intake manifolds for 20 years. He's been promoted to be a technical expert on intake manifolds. So we're just, you know, forget all this testing. We're just going to ask Bob what to do. You know, Bob knows. Let's ask him, right? So I was just amazed as I went through this list of every faux pas we've made in prototyping is really pretty well aligned with those things that were pulling them away from Christ at a spiritual level. But this is a real problem, right? In the automotive industry, it's a problem because guess what? Bob may know some things, but does he know everything? And is it his job to think as deeply about this problem as it is you? No. So, you know, Bob is a resource, but we still have to do the work ourselves. Modern day angel worship or hero worship, I think, is a big problem. You know, if you look at our media-driven society, you know, we tend to idolize or worship, or can fall into the trap of idolizing and worship other people, right? Where Christ should be really the sole focus here. He should be number one in our life. The rich and famous sports heroes, you know, be like Mike, or, you know, pick your favorite sports hero. Titans of industry, great science, superheroes. All these can become things that pull us away from Christ. Thinking at an ecclesial level or church level, can we elevate certain brother or sisters to be our heroes? You know, to be our version of angel worship? You know, perhaps, you know, someone who's written many books, or, you know, someone that's a Bible school speaker or whatever. You know, can we almost take some of the allegiance due to Christ and transfer it over to those people? So another way of being pulled from Christ is hero worship. Ask the expert. You know, kind of follow a particular brother or sister as opposed to following Christ. Okay, problem number 4. I think we heard this one in verses 20 through 23. You're subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, and the neglecting of the body towards the end of the chapter. And, you know, other commandments listed later on in the epistles, abstaining from meats. something that involved a lot of, let's say, self-deprivation. Let's call it extreme self-denial, extreme self-discipline. Anyone have any idea what we're talking about here?
False humility.
False humility, excellent. There was a particular term for this that was asceticism. Boy, you guys are on the ball. Asceticism, exactly. How we doing on time, brother guy? 9 minutes, okay. Asceticism is the practice of strict self-denial as a measure of personal and especially spiritual discipline. The conditioned practice or mode of life as an ascetic, rigorous abstinence from self-indulgence. So this is the idea of, so we've covered salvation through knowledge, salvation through rules, salvation through, hero worship. And now we have salvation through strict self-denial. I call this almost self-worship, right? Just intense focus on our bodies and on our welfare. Now, is it good to be healthy? Is it good to eat right? Is it good to get some exercise? Absolutely. But when that becomes, when we become our own point of worship, that's where it becomes a problem. And it was really highlighted by rigorous self-denial, extreme abstinence, austerity, and really the idea of attaining a high spiritual and moral state through self-denial and self-mortification. Okay, let's go back to the engineering analogy. Kind of think of extremes. Think of, putting a system or a part through extreme states of rigorous, let's say, abuse and punishment, which is really what the ascetics did. They literally kind of just abused themselves to the point of, proving that they were saving themselves through their austerity. Any ideas here? I'll give you a hint. This is finally when we decided, there's no avoiding building prototypes. The computer models don't work, the rules don't work, asking the expert doesn't work. So we're going to have to build some prototypes, all right? But what could be an error once you decided you wanted to build a prototype that you could do to avoid having to build a lot of prototypes?
She's thinking the guy right the first time.
Getting it right the first time? Perfectionism. Excellent. We're getting very warm. Do you think, go ahead.
Go outside the extreme condition.
Yeah. Man, you guys, you're all hired. I mean, this is great. Yeah. What we did is we said, all right, we got to build parts, but let's run them through really extreme tests that, man, if it passes this test, it's good, right? And that way we don't have to run a ton of tests and run really long tests. We can just run shorter, extreme tests, and then that will show that, the part is good. Does this work?
Not always.
Not always. Why not? Right. What you think is the extreme might not actually be the extreme, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later in a later class. But and if you break something on this test, it might actually not have never broken in the field. And what do? You got to add cost to fix this failure mode, which is not a real failure mode. In the meantime, there's other stuff that really does happen that you're not covering. So we fell into the trap of prototyping asceticism. But, think about it. In this day and age, probably the biggest problem we're dealing with in the world is self-worship. The worship of an overemphasis on one's physical well-being and appearance. Extreme diets, extreme exercise. And once again, I'm not saying we shouldn't live healthy, but then getting into, you ever see, no offense to anyone with a tattoo here, but some people are just like head to toe tattoos, like their body has literally become their canvas, right? Of, I don't know, self-expression, whatever. Cosmetic surgeries. But can the truth for us turn into extreme self-discipline and self-denial? You know, can it turn into something where we're kind of saving ourselves through austerity, through almost self-punishment? Because really what that can turn into is a worship of yourself. You know, where you kind of become your own God. All right, so the ecclesia was under pressure in Colossae. Gnosticism, worship of knowledge; legalism, worship of rules; worship of angels, which is akin to worship of heroes; and asceticism, which really turns into worship of ourselves. These are the four things that were pressuring the ecclesia. And then what the apostle is going to do in the next chapter is he's going to show us the right way, right? This is the wrong way, which he covered first. Then he's going to show them, okay, here's how to do it, right? And I found it very helpful because I don't know about you guys, but I feel under pressure. I really do. The world is applying a lot of pressure to us these days. You know, if we ask ourselves what is pulling us away from Christ these days, I would contend it's a lot of the same stuff. You know, human nature has not changed. You know, what the Colossians struggle with, we struggle with. You know, can we get caught up in knowledge for the sake of knowledge? Yeah, we can. Can we get caught up in salvation through rules? Yes, we can. Can we get caught up in looking to others as our saviors instead of Christ, or extreme self-discipline? I haven't quite got so caught up on the extreme self-discipline one yet, but I'm sure that's coming. And if you notice what's unique about these things is they're fairly subtle, right? These things can kind of creep up on us and pull us away from Christ. So in our next class, we're going to start getting into the Apostle Paul's recipe for how to do it. And once again, we're not talking about, none of us are going to be perfect prototypes of Christ, right? That's not going to happen. But we do need to reflect him in some way in our lives. So, preeminence of Christ, we talked about that. The pressures that were pulling them away from Christ, we talked about that. Paul, he just seems very, very worried about their state. And that these Christ blockers, the Gnosticism, the legalism, the worship of angels, the asceticism, were all things that were pulling them away. And I'd contend these are all prevalent in modern days. And did you notice that last verse in Colossians 2? We'll just finish with that. All these things that were pulling them away, I think Paul kind of summarizes it at the end of Colossians 2, where he says, which things were indeed a show of wisdom in will, worship, humility, and neglecting the body, not in any honor to satisfying the flesh. And, you know, I can't find the verse here, but there's a verse here, you guys probably find it before me, which talks about the fact that none of these things have any power to change us. You know, they're really not going to make us, so that'll be our homework assignment, is to find that verse, and we'll bring it into the next class. But none of these things have any power to really change us to be like Christ. So tomorrow we'll start getting into the positive. So thanks for bearing with me on that class. Kind of tough slogging to get through all the how not to do it. But tomorrow we'll start getting into Paul's recipe for how to prototype Christ in our lives.